The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining Your Hour with APA Virginia, sponsored by the Berkeley Group. Your Hour with APA Virginia is typically hosted on the fourth Monday of each month from noon to 1 p.m. We had a slight date change just for this webinar. We are going to give everyone a minute to log in and get settled. All right. Thank you again for joining our webinar today. Before we get started, we want to remind you of a few exciting things APA Virginia has coming up and a couple of housekeeping items. Mark your calendars. APA Virginia's annual conference is scheduled for September 13th through the 16th in Richmond, Virginia. At this time, we have a secondary request for proposals. Additional information can be found on this site, which is apavirginia.com. As we do every month, this webinar, Civic Engagement in the World of Social Distancing, will be recorded and posted to our YouTube page by the end of the day. We encourage you to visit our YouTube and see past webinars or share it with colleagues. As a reminder, we will hold questions until the end, but as the webinar is going on, feel free to type your questions in the question box on your dashboard, and we will answer them at the end in the order they came in. Again, thank you to the Berkeley Group for making this webinar series possible. We are always looking for new webinars, presenters, or topics. If you have one you would like us to look into, please email admin@apavirginia.com. This month's webinar, Civic Engagement in the World of Social Distancing, is presented by three panelists. Our first panelist, Sharon Pandak. Sharon is a partner with the Greenhan, Taves, and Pandak PLLC. She was Prince William County Attorney for 15 years. Sharon provides extensive advice regarding zoning and planning matters for Virginia localities and has represented jurisdictions in land use litigation and has argued several major cases before the Virginia Supreme Court. She has worked on land use issues before the General Assembly, state and federal regulatory bodies. She is General Counsel for the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. Our second presenter is Dr. Neiman Young. Dr. Young retired from the Army in 2017. Shortly after, he went to work for the King George County government. Dr. Young has produced the King George Debt Mitigation Plan, crafted the county's first economic development strategy plan since 1999, renegotiated contracts that have generated millions of dollars in new revenue for the community, and completed a negotiation with the Federal Highway Administration, the Virginia Department of Transportation, and the Maryland Transportation Authority to ensure the county's interests are protected at the completion of the Harry W. Nice Bridge replacement project in 2022. He holds a doctorate in public policy and administration, a master of business administration, and a BA in business. Our final presenter today is David Morley. David is a research program and QA manager at APA in Chicago, where he manages and contributes to sponsored research projects, manages the development of the research knowledge base, provides customized research assistance through the Inquiry Answer Service, develops, organizes, and participates in educational sessions and workshops, and writes for APA publication. He co-edits Zoning Practice. At this time, I will go ahead and mute myself as we get ready for our first presenter.
Good morning. My name is Neiman Young. I'm the County Administrator for King George County, Virginia. I would like to first start by thanking Ms. Tate for the kind words and the pretty extensive bio. More importantly, I would like to thank both Darren Coffey and Eldon James for inviting me to share some time with you all today. Now that we have arrived at the current state of affairs, the COVID-19 pandemic, localities and agencies all over the Commonwealth are looking at ways to incorporate video conferencing software into their toolbox for both internal business and public engagement. Interesting enough, King George County has been utilizing this technology since 2018. And I would like to say that this is because we were clairvoyant or had some type of insight into how we would arrive at today's current state of affairs. However, that is simply not true. Rather, we pursue new platforms for engagement as a result of a string of catastrophic events that forced us to take ownership of keeping our citizens informed rather than continue to rely on third-party organizations to fulfill that void. Next slide. King George County, annotated in red on the map, is strategically located 63 miles north of Richmond and about the same distance south of Washington, D.C. We are a community of slightly over 26,000 citizens. In addition, we have one of the lowest property tax rates in the Commonwealth. Now, that last tidbit of information is not really relevant to the conversation. However, I naturally have an obligation to try to recruit new investments in the community. We have plenty of land, so please feel free to bring your business to King George County. Heck, we'll even sell you a house. But seriously, being a small rural community has its perks, like low taxes and little traffic. It also has its challenges. Specifically, in communities like King George, everyone is either related or went to school with each other. Therefore, we all know each other, and this leads to a more engaged public that is ever demanding for a transparent and responsive government. Yet small communities also face challenges with internet access and modern media platforms. For example, we relied heavily on our resident newspaper to deliver local news to our stakeholders. Yet, after over 40 years of business, the paper was deemed unprofitable and the company closed its doors in 2017. This left us at the mercy of the regional newspaper. While the regional newspaper does exceptionally well at highlighting major happenings in King George, the majority of the paper space is reserved for our large locality neighbors, specifically Pennsylvania, Stafford, and Fredericksburg. This means that a lot of local activity, while important to our community, may be viewed as a lesser priority to the regional paper. Therefore, a lot of our stakeholders often left uninformed on topics that are particularly pressing to our community. Our citizens demanded more and looked to their local government to deliver a solution to feed our data-starved community. As a result, we pursued a multi-pronged approach to not only deliver information to stakeholders, but also receive feedback. This approach included developing a more robust and modern website, stepping up our presence on social media, and procuring go-to-meeting software to help facilitate access to all public meetings of the King George County government. Software is great because it not only provides our citizens a live internet feed of our public meetings, but also has a chat feature and a telephone option to allow for public comments from the general public. It's all about transparency and access. And when I say access, I mean both citizen access to the elected officials and probably more importantly, elected official access to their citizens. This capability has proven critical to our ability to promote public engagement and local government activities. More importantly, it has allowed us to garner buy-in for some pretty major shifts in policy and strategy as we prepare the county for the next chapter in the future. Next slide. In King George, we have 3 tiers of employing video conferencing software. Tier 1 is defined as a routine use of video conferencing software during our business meetings. The purpose of this, again, is to reach our disenfranchised citizens who either cannot make it to the meeting in the evening or need phone access to participate. We then have the second tier, which is defined by a remote access policy. This approach allows for us to accommodate key personnel like elected officials or necessary guests who cannot attend the meeting in person. For example, we had an elected official who was dual hatting as a board of supervisors for King George County and a representative of our state organization, the Virginia Association of Counties, or VACO. Her VACO duties often required her to attend distant conferences that conflict with the dates and times of our local meetings. Therefore, the elected official exercised our go-to-meeting capability as a means to attend our meetings remotely and not have to choose between our state obligations and their duties to King George County. Finally, we recently adopted an all virtual meeting policy. Third tier differs from the remote access policy by allowing us to host a public meeting with no elected officials present in person. Initially, this approach was controversial, as state code has just recently granted localities this flexibility. Prior to state approval, the current pandemic forced localities to take matters into their own hands. We now have an emergency ordinance in place that allows us to meet virtually in order to sustain the government's operations. This may prove crucial in the event that the COVID-19 issue becomes so severe in King George that it is no longer safe for us to meet in person. We understand that this approach may leave some of our citizens feeling a little disenfranchised and a little disengaged. So in the event we do exercise a fully virtual meeting, we have installed measures to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to weigh in on government actions. For example, we have extensive advertising that notifies the public 2 weeks in advance of our intent to host a virtual meeting. In addition, the advertisement details to the letter exactly how citizens can access the virtual platform and how they can provide public comment. Next slide. So I've spoken in great detail about how video conferencing for internal business and public engagement it is. It affords you an opportunity to encourage greater citizen involvement. This especially holds true to your disenfranchised stakeholder, to include the elderly who do not use modern technology, residents who live in rural areas that do not have reliable access to the internet, and even those individuals who work in the evening or have personal issues that prevent them from attending the meeting in person. Casting a larger net into your community will allow for you to gain a better understanding of who we call that silent majority. You see, there's a small minority of citizens that maintain a persistent and loud presence in board meetings. But rather than be squeaky wheels, the silent majority are the bulk of our voters that try to simply stay informed, develop deliberate opinions, and decide by their vote if someone is or if someone is not truly representing their interests in the community. It is essential that we reach out and touch this demographic. By gaining their feedback supported by new technology, we're able to perform azimuth checks and ensure that the policies we are developing are accurately reflect the unique needs of our community. But do not let me mislead you into the belief that video conferencing does not come with its own set of challenges. Please know that above all else, these software platforms are expensive. Every time I cut a check to pay the monthly fees for GoToMeeting, I feel like I am swallowing a big pill. However, I come to accept the fact that it is an investment and we must employ the technology correctly to realize return on that investment. In addition, the software, like any other technology, has a learning curve that must be overcome. It took us a while to grasp the basics of queuing guests and sharing presentations. Yet, after a couple of months of training and hands-on practice, we were finally able to take the management of the platform out of the hands of our IT personnel. Now, the software is managed by our board clerks. They do an exceptional job of delivering a pristine presentation to the general public. In addition to expenses and learning curves, you must be prepared for potential controversy. As we all know, social media platforms provide some people with a sense of anonymity and the courage to behave poorly. For example, you constantly have to concern yourself with profane language, insults directed at local officials, or even commentary that is totally irrelevant to the meeting at hand. Admittedly, these incidents are few and far between. However, controversy is hard to get ahead of, and they can be especially damaging to the sanctity of a public meeting. Some of you may be wondering if the risk is worth the good that the technology affords you. I would say yes. The reality is there always exists the potential for someone to outwardly act out, rather in person or online. So we just try to stay vigilant and cognizant of who is on the platform and what they intend to discuss. Next slide. So we have arrived at the conclusion of my presentation, which includes a laundry list of lessons we have learned since employing video conferencing software. For example, we have learned to always maintain administrative control of the platform. Administrative rights allow you to mute visitors, navigate slide presentations, and most importantly, boot out attendees who prove to be a distraction to the government's business meeting. When we first started using the software, we would often let guests maintain admin rights as they would need it to control the presentations being delivered to the Board of Supervisors. However, this approach exposed the learning curve that I discussed earlier, and we ended up with a lot of mishaps that led to a disconnected and often confusing meeting. So we now have visitors send us their presentations in advance and ask board clerks to navigate the slides as the presenter is speaking. Second is redundancy. This is critically important. Video conferencing software, like any other technology, is flawed, and therefore it will fail you at the most unfortunate time. This can prove catastrophic to a public body, as we're supposed to maintain minutes and records of virtually every word uttered in a public meeting. So we have learned to use the software, but also maintain a camera in the room that records the meeting. The video captured by the secondary camera, then used for writing our minutes and producing live feeds for cable television and YouTube. This way, if the software fails, citizens can move to a secondary pipeline, stay engaged. Finally, I see that Ms. Pandak is going to touch on this next bullet point. But do know that in King George County, we're committed to using software platforms to sustain essential government functions only. This means that we're trying to avoid passing instrument policies that we know would normally generate a lot of feedback from the general public if they were afforded unrestrained access to our meetings. This includes public hearings for land use decisions. We understand that there are timelines for development applications, and we're performing a delicate balancing act to meet the need to make those decisions while affording our citizens their right to weigh in on those decisions. Next slide. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll encourage questions at the end of the full presentation. I'll be standing by, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to the next panelist.
Thank you, Neiman. This is Sharon Pandak. I'm going to talk to you about legal developments, and I know all you planners are cringing, but there are also some attorneys that are listening in as well. Some of you may know that I grew up in Stanton. I went to college and law school in Williamsburg, and I'm coming to you from Woodbridge. I can say further that Neiman's statements about King George County make it an excellent case study, and I'm fortunate enough to drive through King George fairly frequently. So next slide. I want to talk to you about staying connected in order to make government work safely through the use of virtual meetings. And to summarize what I think is going to be maybe a boatload of information, I want to discuss the evolving law regarding presence in meetings. I absolutely am going to tell you that local public entities can legally meet virtually. And then I'll talk about some standards and guidelines for public meetings. I think Neiman has pointed out a lot of good pros and cons to consider. Next slide. With respect to the legal background, we sometimes want to date ourselves by different occasions in time. And so I'm doing pre-COVID-19. If you were looking at this as a multiple choice question, it means one of the following: statutes prior to the 2020 General Assembly, when pandemic was not a contemplated emergency, or who thought an emergency could last so long. Social distancing was not part of the parlance, except maybe in high school. When we last got good haircuts, well, actually the answer is all of the above. Next slide. As we look at pre-COVID-19 and meeting, you'll note from the picture that this is fairly typical. It was physical presence of at least a quorum of the public body being required under the Virginia Freedom of Information Act that I'll call FOIA. We might also call it togetherness, which is antithetical to the current social distancing. Next slide. In reviewing this legal background, we have to have some common nomenclature, and I will use electronic or virtual meetings for purposes of my presentation as being those meetings as set forth under the Freedom of Information Act 2.23708.2, meetings held through electronic communications of public bodies. We'll talk more about that section. I want to note, though, that electronic meetings where 3 or more members of the public body are not present to do business, and there's not a committee of 2 or more, it doesn't follow, they don't follow under the FOIA public meeting requirements. And so this presentation and the legal constraints are not going to be relevant, even though you may choose to follow them in your localities. Next slide. Looking at 2.23708.2, there is a requirement of a physical quorum, that is togetherness, of the public body in one location unless pursuant to subsection A3, the governor's declared a state of emergency pursuant to statute. The catastrophic nature of the emergency makes it impracticable or unsafe to assemble a quorum in one location, and the purpose of the meeting is to address the emergency. There are also requirements for notice, public access, and documentation. I want to note that, as you all may know, there are provisions for individual members of the public body participating electronically in that statute as well. Again, though, a physical quorum being required. Next slide. So COVID-19 comes after the 2020 General Assembly main session, and it stays and it stays. You have further the legal foundation for virtual meetings increasing with the presidential declaration of emergency, then the governor's declaration of emergency and subsequent executive orders for stay away, your local jurisdictions declaring emergencies, and tangentially, but not irrelevant for those of us that worry about legal challenges, the Virginia Supreme Court's declaration of judicial emergency and those extensions which continue today. However, if we're looking back at 2.23708.2, all we can talk about are emergencies at virtual meetings. And local governments need to do more than that as the pandemic stays and stays. Both residents and businesses expect local governments to govern. So, enter on March 20th, the Attorney General's opinion. Next slide. The March 20th Attorney General opinion was in response to requests by Delegate Rip Sullivan on behalf of localities who were frustrated with trying to figure out how to use the current FOIA statute. That opinion is really very important because it provides, in our mind, a roadmap of authority for local governing bodies to hold wholly electronic meetings on matters which the locality determines to be essential governmental functions. And we should always keep this in mind, with notice to the public and public access. This AG opinion charts the authority also for regional boards and commissions to conduct their meetings on essential business wholly electronically during the emergency. Next slide. Now, I've already talked to you about 2.23708.2, and the AG's opinion talks about why that statute doesn't work here. However, importantly, the AG's opinion concludes that a separate section, 15.2.14.13, authorizes a locality to adopt an ordinance for continuity of its government in a case of a disaster, pointing particularly to the current virus. And under that authority, localities may hold public meetings electronically and without a quorum of the members physically present in one place to ensure that, quote, essential governmental functions are carried out. And as you all know, when you look at the statute, it allows that emergency ordinance to occur during the time of the disaster and then continue on for 6 months thereafter. Some may say, why does that make a difference? Well, I think when the General Assembly was first looking at these types of statutes, they looked at where there might be a disruption of a hurricane, an enemy invasion, where maybe not the next day can you reopen and say, well, it's over, we're ready to start business again. So the 6 months is in there. Next slide. Enter the local government attorneys of Virginia. The president of the LGA, Tim Spencer from Roanoke, decided that it was important to have a committee of attorneys who could enable advice during this period in time to assist local government attorneys in addressing issues and to provide advice to public officials where appropriate. So the committee has done that on several occasions. The committee's conclusion is that the Attorney General's opinion supports the work that we've done and a checklist we've distributed in developing guidance to localities and other local and regional public entities to conduct electronic meetings without a quorum of the body assembled. And you have my citation to where you can pick up a copy of that guidance. After we sent that guidance out, enter the next phase. Next slide. The governor's budget amendment was adopted and was submitted by the governor for consideration at the veto session and enrolled by the Virginia General Assembly this month. And there are a number of ways of designating that amendment, and I've included, I think, a comprehensive set there on the slide. Importantly, I want to note a number of senators spoke about how helpful they thought this amendment was in terms of allowing localities to run their governments. And I want to particularly quote the statement of Senator Stewart when the matter came up. We need to adopt this so that local governments can continue to run their counties. I know that local governments and other agencies need the ability to meet and conduct regular business. Next slide. In the budget amendment itself, there is an explanation, which is the statement that appears on this slide in parentheses. It states, not surprisingly, this amendment provides authority for public bodies, including agencies, boards, and common interest communities, parenthetically HOAs, to conduct electronic meetings during a declared state of emergency when it is impracticable or unsafe to assemble a quorum in a single location. Next slide. I have on this slide the entire budget amendment. If you want to read the text, I'm not going to go through it that way. Next slide. The governor's budget amendment highlights are on this slide. Importantly, there must be a declared state of emergency. The nature of the emergency makes it impractical or unsafe for the body to meet in one location. The purpose of the meeting is to discuss or transact business statutorily required or necessary to continue operations of the public body and the discharge of its lawful purposes, duties, and responsibilities. Capture that is everything it needs to do. And third, a recording or transcript of the meeting is available on its website pursuant to other provisions of FOIA. Next slide. The budget amendment highlights continue here with pointing out that the public body, pursuant to this new piece of legislation, must give notice to the public using the best available method, contemporaneously with notice to members of the public body, not unusual. Second, to arrange for public access through electronic means, including to the extent practicable, video conferencing technology, not unusual. If possible, to provide the public an opportunity to comment, we may touch on that later, to comply otherwise with the statute I referred to earlier, 2.23708.2, and that you have to state in the minutes the nature of the emergency, the fact the meeting was held by electronic communication, and the type of electronic communication. Next slide. So where are we with respect to electronic meetings? My conclusion is that there is ample authority to meet virtually during this declared emergency to conduct the locality's business, and that this includes holding public hearings. Now, as Neiman mentioned to you, King George and other localities have chosen on occasion or not at all to hold electronic meetings. They can do that. Our view is that there's ample authority. Next slide. Couple of things that are important. Aim to conduct important business. And I'll get to my asterisks later. Give notice to the public and access to the public. Provide a means for public input if it's required. provide a means of documenting the meeting and linking to the website, note the electronic meeting and the reason in the minutes, and consider a return to physical quorums for meetings when the emergency is over. I note this particularly, the foregoing items are all relevant to the new budget amendment legislation. But if you use the 15.2.14.13 authority through the AG's opinion, you have an additional 6 months. Under the budget amendment, it would end when the emergency ends. And that budget amendment is in effect until June of 2022. Next slide. What does the asterisk mean? As I pointed out, there are differences in the authority between that pursuant to the discussion on roadmap in the AG opinion versus that in the budget amendment, even though there's a lot of overlap, which leads me to conclusion that there's ample authority. So for example, if you don't want to require a public comment period when it's not otherwise legally required, then you might want to use 15.2.14.13 because some people conclude that the new legislation, the budget amendment, requires public comment even though you haven't done it before. I'm not of that view, but there are those that say that that's what the language says. Secondly, if you want to avoid posting transcripts or recordings of meetings, and we acknowledge that some localities may have problems doing this technologically still, then 15.2.14.13, that roadmap with the continuity of government emergency ordinance don't require it. The budget amendments do. And then finally, I mentioned the issue with respect to electronic meetings up to 6 months after the emergency. Next slide. So where are we again? Acquire and test good technology. And I will refer you to all the points that Neil made in this regard. Further, I would urge you to work with your chairs to summarize the process that's going to be held with respect to the meeting at the beginning of the meeting. This will inspire confidence that the meeting is being conducted properly, is accessible to the public, and documented, and you're less likely to have glitches, quote unquote, hopefully. Next slide. The future of how you and whether localities can have greater use of technology to conduct public business in Virginia depends on your localities, both individually and as an aggregate, using it well and doing so in a transparent, accessible, and consistent manner. So I go back to the future with Walt Kelly and tell you, as Pogo did, that we have met the enemy and he is us. Next slide. I would also be remiss in not telling you to consult with your local government attorney well in advance of a planned electronic public meeting. I know that many times staff members want to get out in front and make sure information gets out, and at times it is inconsistent with what the actual law is. So I encourage you to coordinate, because if you have that problem with lack of foresight or glitches or inconsistent messaging, the credibility of your governing body is going to be impacted. And if it impacts you, it impacts the rest of us. Last slide. Thank you very much for your participation and for your work during this time. It is critically important. Stay healthy. Your locality needs you. I turn it over to David for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I'm going to try to share my screen here, just a second. Okay. Well, thank you again, Sharon and Neiman and Paige, and thank you to everyone at APA Virginia for inviting me to share some time with you today. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm excited to share a little bit about a new tool from APA that ties in nicely with our topic. So over the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to share some background about APA's research knowledge base, which I think is a significant benefit for all APA members. Then I'll take us on an abbreviated tour of a new collection in the knowledge base that compiles resources on online public engagement tools and techniques. Finally, I'll say a little bit about how each of you can contribute to the collection. So, APA's Research Knowledge Base is a database-driven tool that connects users to topically related resources from APA as well as from other planning-friendly sources. The goal of the project is to create a central repository of planning-related knowledge. And more concretely, APA wants to provide its members with a self-directed tool that will help them take the next step in whatever project they're working on. We're also hoping that by connecting our members to the best available information that's out there, we're going to help them elevate the practice of planning. And just in case this wasn't clear already, all APA members do have access to the research knowledge base, but select collections are also open to the general public. At the most fundamental level, the research knowledge base consists of a section of the APA website with specialized functionality, which you can think of as the container, and a tremendous amount of planning-related knowledge, which you can think of as the content. And to be a little bit more concrete, the tool consists of a series of collections of topically related resources. And each collection has its own landing page with commentary that offers a primer on the topic and links to both APA and non-APA resources. So APA launched the Research Knowledge Base back in June of 2017 with 25 collections. And currently there are more than 60 collections covering topics ranging from accessory dwelling units to zoning variances and thousands of connected resources within those collections. There are two ways to search the knowledge base. You can search across all collections from the search bar on the Research Knowledge Base landing page on the left there, or you can search within a collection from the search bar on each individual collection's landing page, which is the image on the right. After searching, you can filter results by relevant community contexts, by APA resource formats, by relevant jurisdiction types or geographic scales, by resource categories used across all collections, by population density, and population ranges for resources associated with examples of practice, and APA website topics. One of the newest additions to the Research Knowledge Base is a collection focused on online public engagement. While we've had this topic on our to-do list for quite some time, the current pandemic really served as a kick in the pants for us. And to be clear, so far the speakers today have been focusing almost exclusively on virtual public meetings, which is certainly an important topic covered in this collection. But the collection is much broader than that too, to reflect the fact that community engagement in planning practice goes well beyond simply statutorily required meetings of official bodies. So we knew that a lot of planning departments and firms were going to need help reorganizing around a digital-first engagement strategy, and we wanted to connect them with information that would both help their most pressing short-term needs, like hosting their first virtual planning or zoning board meetings, but also help them use online participation tools in more expansive or creative ways to help the communities they serve as they try to adapt to new challenges and opportunities. Now I just want to take a few minutes to spotlight some of the resources that give a taste of what you'll find as you explore the collection. So some of the resources in the collection provide valuable insights into the state of the practice. For example, this compendium of fact sheets from the Federal Highway Administration. It covers techniques such as virtual town halls, project visualizations, and mobile applications. And each fact sheet in this compendium here includes a description of the tool, tips, and examples of it in practice. Another example from the collection is the Participate DB Clearinghouse. This catalogs hundreds of specific online engagement tools and projects. I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling, and it covers the United States and as well as projects from around the world. The third example is a UN report which provides a high-level overview of online engagement practices at multiple levels of government in multiple parts of the world. I think it's a pretty good place to sort of jump into the collection if you're just trying to see, you know, what is the state of the practice globally, and how does that stack up with what you might be doing in your community. Other resources in the collection provide guidance to help planners and public officials develop and implement online public engagement strategies. For instance, this briefing paper from the International Association of Public Participation provides guidance to help practitioners think strategically about online engagement tools, including bridging the digital divide and as well as managing online risk. And this guide from the Engagement Lab at Emerson College in Boston uses the experiences of 5 city governments to illustrate key considerations for online public engagement. The third example here is from another Dillon's Rule state, Vermont, and it provides a model script for opening a virtual public meeting, as well as guidance for selecting meeting software and a checklist for holding virtual public meetings. Finally, some of the resources in this collection provide insight into how specific communities are taking advantage of opportunities as well as navigating challenges associated with online public engagement. For example, this APA podcast features the former chair of Fayetteville, Arkansas's Planning Commission talking about the city's first online meeting last month. In this guide for city staff and consultants in Salt Lake City, which addresses online meetings, presentations, and webinars, and discusses equity and accessibility issues in online outreach platforms and methods. This third example here shares tips and lessons learned from Providence, Rhode Island's early experiences with Zoom meetings, specifically in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. The online public engagement collection, like all of our research knowledge-based collections, is a dynamic tool. This means that we encourage all APA members to play an active role in expanding and improving it. And there are 2 ways that you can help do this. First, you can write a story. You can describe your personal or professional experiences with online public engagement in order to inform, engage, or enlighten other members interested in the topic. Second, you can suggest resources to add to the collection. These may be resources you personally had a hand in creating or just something you came across that you think others could benefit from. And honestly, you can also use this feature to report maintenance issues like broken links in the collection. Thank you again to everyone that's participating in this webinar for letting me share a little bit more about how APA is helping to respond to the evolving needs of our members. And I'm looking forward to a rich discussion.
Thank you again to our presenters. We appreciate your time and your advice during this time. We will take the last few minutes of our webinar to do some questions. We have one question here. What program does King George County use to present its meetings?
Yes, we utilize GoToMeeting software. I know that Zoom seems to be the program of record of some of the other agencies that we have been engaging with, but we have learned that Zoom has some previous security issues that were pretty concerning to our IT department. So we decided to not transfer to that platform. We are utilizing GoToMeeting, and we find that it's robust enough to accommodate our needs in King George.
This is a 2-part question we have. How much internet access do residents have? And are there any solutions to reduced accessibility for older, less technologically savvy residents?
In King George County, we estimate that there's approximately 30% of our community that does not have access to internet or broadband. So that's a challenge that we continue to work on even to this day. Basically, a problem that's been that's probably decades old, but I think that we're closely approaching a solution to that issue. Regarding our elderly, that's a big concern in King George County. We have a higher demographic of elderly people in King George County, and I define that as individuals 60 years of age or older. So naturally, we're sensitive to our ability to ensure those that are technology challenged have that capabilities to access the local government and our public meetings. That's why we utilize GoToMeeting and exercise that phone option. So we can ensure that individuals that can't access our meetings via the internet can actually engage us via telephone if they need to make activities.
If I might, Paige, to add, localities are being creative on how they take input from segments of the community. Some are using electronic platforms, phone, as Neiman mentioned, or emails. Others, when they have public comment or public hearings, are actually having that done physically, either with spacing people as they come into a room in order to make a video presentation that goes out virtually, or having a place for people can go in and video and comment by video, which then gets transmitted to the public entity.
Our next question is also, do you have any numbers about meeting participation and viewing as compared to prior participation and attendance of in-person meetings?
Yes, we do. We actually are able to see everybody that is online, and we are able to maintain counts of each meeting's participation. And yes, I would say that is definitely trended upwards since the pandemic, and since we have decided to rely more heavily on our software platform versus allowing the general public to access our facilities. I think that the reason for this is twofold. Number one, of course, since they don't have public access to our buildings, they want to still maintain visibility on public meetings. But more importantly, I think that there's just still a lot of concern and questions out there regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. So those that usually wouldn't be interested in routine government business are actually looking to get more information about the pandemic and how it could potentially affect them personally.
Another question for Dr. Young. Do you have ideas for or examples of how to expand virtual engagement to residents who have limited or no access to internet at home? How can we ensure equity?
Yes, we're always looking for new ideas to make our meetings more robust. So though it does limit participation, we have taken other approaches to ensure that at the least our disenfranchised citizens are able to view public meetings, and while not in real time, they still can at least submit letters or phone calls to the local government, specifically my office, regarding any concerns that they have about public policy or activities taking place in the government. These approaches include, again, we offer a recording of our meeting on YouTube. We also offer the meetings on MetroCast cable television, and then we also record our meetings onto a DVD, and we supply that DVD to the library so people can actually check out DVDs for board meetings, and they could view them at their own leisure in the comforts of their own home.
If I could weigh in on that too, just for a second, just to build off what Neiman was saying. He mentioned, and virtually any discussion on this topic that you can run into right now is going to stress the importance of, at an absolute minimum, if you're going to have a virtual meeting, having a audio only call-in option for folks to participate is sort of the bare minimum for expanding that access. There are other places around the country that have switched to virtual meetings, but are retaining one public access site where physical distancing is maintained at that site, but it gives a chance for folks who may not have reliable internet access or any internet access to show up and participate in real time through an on-site moderator there. And beyond that, just to reiterate what Neiman was saying, it's important to remember that there is still a segment in many communities or most communities that just simply isn't going to be able to participate in real time with the meeting. And therefore, it's certainly important to continue to provide opportunities to comment in advance of whatever decisions might be made at that meeting through more traditional means. And then again, at a minimum, if you have the capability to broadcast that meeting through a cable service in your locality, then, or even broadcast it over the air, then that is again sort of a minimum good thing to do.
Our next question is to Sharon. Public bodies that are not local governing bodies cannot access 15.2-1413. Is that correct?
There is a difference of opinion on that. The view of the LGA committee was that in fact those entities could utilize the authority of 15.2-1413 through the declaration of emergency and ordinance of continuity of government by the component of jurisdictions. And a number of those governing bodies have in fact included such references in their continuity of government ordinances. And separately, by extension, through the roadmap provided by, or not separately, but also by extension in the roadmap provided by the Attorney General's opinion of March 20th. As I noted, there is some disagreement in that regard. That in part we understand prompted, although not solely, the governor's budget amendments. And after those budget amendments, those who had that concern about non-local governing bodies being able to conduct virtual meetings should have those concerns dissipated. And because that budget amendment clearly does allow that.
To answer our next few questions, this entire webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to the chapter's YouTube page for further viewing. And also please expect an email, if not by the end of today, then early tomorrow, with a link to view the webinar as well. Our next question is to Dr. Young. Please explain or expand upon prepared presentations with regard to maintaining administrative control of the platform.
Yes, well, let's utilize this webinar, for example. My slides were maintained by Mrs. Tate, and she retained administrative rights. So I could not navigate those slides because I didn't have the rights to the controls of this platform. So I had to ask Ms. Tate to to change the slides by saying next slide. And that's basically the same approach that we take in King George County. Originally, we were turning over administrative rights to the presenters. At any given time at a board meeting, we could have 3 or 4 presenters in the evening, and we turn over administrative rights each time to them so they can navigate their own slides. But that proved challenging because sometimes we'll turn over the slides to a presenter who had had no exposure to GoToMeeting or video conferencing software. So while him or she were trying to navigate their slides, they end up pressing wrong buttons and may click themselves out of the meeting or may click on to another portion of the program. And all those activities can actually be seen by the general public. So we felt that it was causing a little bit of confusion and the meetings were no longer seamless. So we decided that we'd have all the presentations given over to our board clerks, and they maintain responsibility for administrative rights over the platform.
Our next question is again for Dr. Young. How are you handling community meetings, those for the community prior to PC/BOS hearings? Are applicants/developers solely responsible for facilitating them, or is it the county providing any assistance?
Currently, we have suspended public hearings in King George County, and admittedly, that's only going to last and be accepted for so long. We have two major land use cases that are sitting in the queue that sooner or later we're going to have to decide how we're going to move forward with hosting those public hearings and having the board make decisions on these applications. When that decision is made to go ahead and move forward on sustaining or returning to public hearings, that's going to be maintained and hosted by the county government, not the developer. We won't, and I think that it'd be unfair for us to host those public meetings in an all virtual meeting, thereby denying those that can't participate in the meetings to comment on major land use decisions in King George County. So I think that we're just going to have to figure out open air facility as the worst case scenario to host those public hearings and afford everybody who wants to comment on major land use decisions the ability to engage the board and engage the developer.
Another question for you, Dr. Young. What methods have you found successful to engage the silent participants in a virtual meeting?
Well, that's interesting that you bring that up. We've actually taken not only just regular business meetings to the virtual platform. Last night, we actually held a virtual town hall, which I participated in with one of my elected officials. Town halls have proven, in-person town halls have proven to be much more useful in our ability to get out there to the general public and engage those that normally do not participate in routine business meetings. And I think the reason why it attracts that silent majority is because that gives them an opportunity to comment or ask questions or discuss things that are important to them. I don't think that they have a real large concern with consent agendas or, topics on the agenda that are absolutely necessary to sustain government operations. But when we offer them an opportunity to come to the board and come make complaints about, trash convenience centers or, poke us a little bit about what we're doing about broadband. Well, that gets those individuals that don't normally attend business meetings to come out and engage with their elected officials and get to understand and develop that relationship. We were doing that in person, and that was successful. And now we're just basically imitating that on video conferencing software.
And we are going to answer just one more question as time allows. So I will go ahead and read that. Excellent session. Thanks so much to APA Virginia and APA generally for its sponsorship. Question: how can we continue to engage planning staff during a time of furloughs, layoffs, etc.? Planners bring expert input to land use, transportation, and related decisions, but we may be losing that insight during the current crisis.
I will note in my capacity as General Counsel for the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments that there are still meetings being held regionally with planners in the Northern Virginia, Maryland, and District of Columbia. And there will be things that come out of that that I think will be useful to the resumption or reopening.
Okay, any other responses from our panelists?
Well, from a national perspective, just again, building off what Sharon said, across the country, planners are still playing a major role in providing guidance to the communities that they serve, not just about land use applications, but many folks are continuing with long-range planning projects and policy reforms. So it's certainly happening. So I'm not sure if I am quite addressing the gist of the question itself, but definitely planners are still engaged in planning activities.
All right, so that is all the time that we have for you today. We thank our panelists again for their insight and advice, and we thank all of those who were able to join us live. Again, we will post this webinar to the chapter's YouTube page, so please feel free to share it with colleagues and those that might have questions regarding this topic. Thank you again, and we'll see you in May.